Ingrid Sørensen had always dreamed of something bigger than the quiet small village in Norway where she was born. Life in her hometown was simple, and while it had its comforts, Ingrid yearned for more. The snow-covered landscapes and the familiar faces in her village had always felt like they were confining her to a life she wasn't sure she wanted. Her dreams were larger, and though she didn't fully know what those dreams were, she knew they didn't fit into the life she had in Norway. Her chance came one evening, after years of corresponding through letters with a man from across the ocean. His name was David, and he lived in a place that seemed so far away, Montana. The pictures he sent her showed wide-open skies, golden fields, and what appeared to be an endless horizon. David was a rancher, a man of the land, and though their correspondence was brief, it was filled with kind words and the promise of a life Ingrid had always dreamed of. She never thought twice about the decision. It felt like fate was calling her. Ingrid's family was supportive, though some of her relatives and friends raised concerns. Leaving everything behind to marry a man she had never met in person seemed like a big step. But Ingrid felt an adventurous pull, something she could not explain but knew she had to follow. After much thought, she packed her bags and boarded the ship that would take her across the Atlantic towards the unknown. The journey was long, but Ingrid's excitement grew with every passing mile. She imagined what her life would be like in Montana, and she pictured herself riding horses across vast fields, living in a small, cozy cabin with a kind man who would love her. But nothing could have prepared her for what awaited her when she finally arrived. When Ingrid first laid eyes on David, he was everything his letters had promised. He was tall, strong, and had the weathered look of a man who had spent his life working the land. His smile was warm, and he had kind eyes, but there was a nervous energy about him, as though he too was unsure of what the future held. The first few days were a whirlwind of excitement. Ingrid tried to immerse herself in the life David had shown her in his letters, learning about the ranch, the animals, and the vast expanse of land they lived on. But something was different than she had imagined. The land was much colder than she had expected, and the wide open spaces felt intimidating. At night, the sky seemed darker than she had ever seen before, and the silence around the ranch was almost deafening. Then came the language barrier. Ingrid had learned some English in school, but speaking it out loud was a different challenge. Her accent was thick, and many of the words she said didn't come out the way she wanted them to. In the beginning, David was patient. He tried to help her with her pronunciation and vocabulary, but as days passed, Ingrid noticed that the people in town didn't seem as welcoming as she had hoped. At first it was subtle, just a sideways glance here, a muffled laugh there, but soon it became impossible to ignore. Some of the locals openly mocked her for her English, making it clear that they didn't see her as part of their community. They would laugh when she struggled to find the right word or mispronounced something, often repeating her mistakes in a way that made Ingrid feel small. It wasn't intentional cruelty, she thought at first, but it still hurt. The more she tried to speak, the more she felt like an outsider, a foreigner who didn't belong. She had come to Montana to start a new life, but all she felt was the weight of the gap between her and everyone around her. David, for all his kindness, seemed unable to change the attitudes of the townspeople. He didn't seem to notice the little comments or the laughter when Ingrid stumbled over her words. She didn't blame him. He had lived here for so long, and perhaps the way things worked in Montana was just normal to him. Still, Ingrid couldn't help but feel alone. She missed her family, missed the comfort of her small village, and more than anything, she missed the feeling of being understood. As the days turned into weeks, Ingrid did her best to fit in. She worked alongside David on the ranch, feeding the animals, cleaning the stables, and helping with whatever she could. But the more she worked, the more isolated she felt. The ranch was a huge place, and there was always something to do, but the physical work didn't make her feel connected to the people. The ranch was beautiful, with wide stretches of land and sweeping views of the mountains, but it felt empty, almost as though it were a place for solitude rather than a community. When she would go into town to run errands or buy supplies, the discomfort she felt was always present. Some people were kind, but many of them gave her looks that made her feel like she didn't belong. She had trouble with the simple things, ordering food at the local cafe, finding the right words for small talk, and trying to understand the local dialect, which was different from the English she had learned back home. Every misstep felt like a reminder that she was an outsider. David, though loving and patient, was not always around. He had his own responsibilities, and his work on the ranch kept him busy. It was clear that he cared for Ingrid deeply, but he couldn't fully understand the weight of her loneliness. He had spent years on this land, and it was a part of him.
Ingrid, on the other hand,
felt as though she was still trying to find her place in it. One evening, after a long day of work, Ingrid sat outside the small cabin she shared with David. The sky was painted with streaks of orange and purple as the sun dipped behind the mountains. Ingrid took a deep breath, hoping the cool air would settle her racing thoughts. She couldn't help but think about her life back in Norway, how simple and familiar everything had been. She missed her family, the rolling hills where she had once wandered, and even the cold, constant snowfall that had been a part of her life for so long. But that life was behind her now. She had made a choice, and though she had moments of doubt, Ingrid knew she couldn't turn back. She had left everything for this new life in Montana, for David, for the hope of something better. But in that moment, she wasn't sure if better was enough to make up for the loneliness and the challenges she faced every day. Ingrid had thought that love and adventure would be enough to carry her through the difficult moments, but as the weeks wore on, she found herself wondering if she had made the right choice. The land was vast, but so was her feeling of isolation. And the people, while friendly, still saw her as an outsider, a woman who didn't quite fit in with the tough, independent spirit of Montana. Yet, as Ingrid sat under the fading light of that evening sky, she knew that this was only the beginning. She had taken a big leap, and even though the challenges ahead seemed daunting, she also knew that life had a way of unfolding in unexpected ways. Whatever came next, she had to face it. There was no turning back now. In the days that followed Ingrid's arrival, life on the ranch started to settle into a routine. Each morning, she would wake early, long before the sun had fully risen, and begin her day with the chores that came with ranch life. There were always animals to feed, the horses to tend to, and the barns to clean. At first, these tasks felt overwhelming. The ranch was far bigger than she had imagined, and the work seemed endless. But Ingrid had always been a hard worker, and she threw herself into it with all her energy, hoping that the physical tasks would help distract her from the loneliness she often felt. David was kind but busy, and Ingrid could see that he had a lot on his shoulders. He would help her when he could, guiding her through the work she wasn't yet familiar with. His patience was endless, but Ingrid could see the exhaustion in his eyes. He had been working the land for many years, and the strain of keeping up with everything was beginning to show. He often worked late into the night, and Ingrid could hear him outside, chopping wood or fixing fences by the dim light of the lantern. The days seemed to blend together, and with each passing one, Ingrid found herself feeling more and more like a stranger. She was trying so hard to learn, to become a part of this new world, but the weight of being different never left her. The local people, while polite, still didn't make her feel welcome. Whenever she tried to engage in conversation, her accent stood out like a sore thumb. She would find herself stumbling over words, unable to express what she truly wanted to say. The people in town would politely listen, but Ingrid could see the judgment in their eyes. Some would make little comments behind her back, and others would laugh when she mispronounced a word. It wasn't mean-spirited, but it hurt all the same. Ingrid didn't understand why they couldn't see beyond her accent. After all, she was trying her best. But in their eyes, she was still the foreign woman who didn't quite belong. They might smile at her, but there was always a sense that she wasn't truly part of their community. As the weeks wore on, Ingrid grew more discouraged. Every day she woke up with a sense of hope, determined to fit in and to learn. But every day that hope seemed to slip further and further away. The ranch was beautiful, no doubt. The land stretched out in every direction, covered in fields of green and golden hills. But there was a coldness to it, a silence that Ingrid could never get used to. It felt as though the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. And then there was the language. Ingrid had always thought she was good at learning new things. Back in Norway, she had studied English for years, and though she didn't speak it perfectly, she had always been confident in her abilities. But here, it felt as though the more she tried to speak, the more her words were twisted and misunderstood. Simple things like asking for directions or ordering food became embarrassing experiences. The locals, who spoke with their own thick accents, often responded in ways that made Ingrid feel even more self-conscious. One day, when she went into town to buy groceries, she decided to practice her English with the shopkeeper. She had been working so hard on her pronunciation, and she thought this would be a good chance to test herself. She walked up to the counter and greeted the man with a smile, but when she spoke, the words seemed to slip out wrong. She asked for a loaf of bread, but it came out more like "bleedy" than the smooth word she intended. The shopkeeper didn't say anything, but Ingrid noticed the faint smirk on his face as he reached for the bread. It was just one small moment, but it cut deep. She had worked so hard on her English, and here she was, still being mocked by the simplest things. Ingrid quickly paid for her items and hurried back to the ranch, her heart heavy with frustration. She had wanted so badly to fit in, to be a part of this place, but it felt like no matter how much she tried, she would always be the foreigner, the outsider. That night, as she worked beside David, she couldn't help but let her feelings show. "I don't think they like me here," Ingrid said quietly, trying not to let her voice crack. "I try to speak to them, but they laugh at me. I feel like I don't belong." David looked at her, his face softening. "They don't mean any harm, Ingrid," he said gently. "It's just that you're new and people can be nervous around things they don't understand." Ingrid nodded, though she didn't feel comforted. She knew David didn't mean to hurt her, but his words didn't change the reality of how she felt. She was trying her best, but it seemed like her best wasn't enough. It was as if the more she worked to fit in, the more she stood out. She couldn't understand why they couldn't see past her accent, past the fact that she wasn't from here. She had come here with hope, but all she felt now was the weight of her difference. As days turned into weeks, Ingrid found herself retreating more and more into the ranch. The vastness of the land felt less like a place to explore and more like a reminder of how isolated she was. The wide, empty fields seemed to stretch on forever, and Ingrid couldn't shake the feeling that she, too, was just a small part of the emptiness. The silence of the ranch was almost too much to bear, and there were moments when she would sit outside, watching the sun dip behind the mountains, wondering if she had made the right choice. David, for all his care, didn't seem to understand the depth of Ingrid's isolation. He loved her, that was clear. But the silence between them grew with every passing day. There were no words for what Ingrid was feeling, no way to explain the loneliness that wrapped around her like a heavy blanket. She had left everything she knew for this, for a chance at something new. But now she wasn't sure what it was she had come to. Still, she didn't want to give up. She couldn't. There was a part of her that refused to accept this feeling of defeat. Ingrid had always been strong, had always faced the challenges life threw at her. She didn't want to let a little thing like language stand in her way. She couldn't afford to let herself feel sorry for what she had left behind. After all, she had chosen this life. She had chosen David, and though the road ahead seemed long and full of obstacles, Ingrid knew there had to be more to it than this. One afternoon, as she worked in the barn, Ingrid overheard a conversation between a few of the local women who had come to visit David. They were talking about the ranch and how much work it required. But one woman, a neighbor named Martha, casually mentioned how cute Ingrid's accent was. The tone wasn't unkind, but it felt as though Ingrid was the subject of their amusement. They were not malicious, but the comments stung just the same. For the first time, Ingrid allowed herself to feel angry. She wasn't a joke, she wasn't something to be laughed at. She was a woman trying to build a life here, a life that she had chosen. And though it was hard, though it felt lonely, Ingrid knew that if she wanted to make it, she would have to stop hiding behind her insecurities. It wasn't going to be easy. She knew that. But if there was one thing Ingrid had learned from her years in Norway, it was that strength came from facing the hardest challenges head-on. And this was just the beginning. She had no intention of letting her accent or her differences define her. The storm, whatever it was, could wait. As the winter months crept closer, the atmosphere in Montana began to change. Ingrid could feel it in the air, the biting chill that had started to settle into her bones the way the days grew shorter and the long nights seemed endless. The ranch, which had felt so vast and open in the spring and summer, now seemed a little more foreboding. The harshness of the land became more apparent as the temperature dropped, and Ingrid could hear the winds howling outside as the first snowstorms began to roll in. It wasn't just the weather that was changing. Life on the ranch had become harder as the days got colder. David was working even longer hours, preparing the ranch for the winter season. The animals needed more care, The barns needed to be reinforced, and the fences had to be checked to make sure they could withstand the heavy snowfall. Ingrid, though still struggling with the language barrier, tried her best to help with all the chores, even though the cold made everything harder. The wind bit at her skin as she worked in the barn, shoveling hay and making sure the animals were warm enough. She had never experienced anything like this back in Norway, but she was learning quickly. Despite the challenges, there was something comforting about the routine. It was familiar in a way that made her feel like she was starting to belong. Every morning she woke up early to help David with whatever needed to be done. The days were long and the nights were quiet, but Ingrid felt a small sense of pride as she got used to the work. She still missed her family and the life she had left behind, but she had come to realize that this was the life she had chosen, and if she was going to make it, she had to learn to accept it. David, on the other hand, seemed to be getting more tired as the days went by. The ranch work, combined with the coming winter, was weighing heavily on him. He would spend hours outside, checking the fences, feeding the livestock, and preparing everything for the harsh weather, but his body was beginning to show signs of exhaustion. Ingrid could see it in his face. The lines on his forehead deepened and his shoulders seemed to sag with the weight of his responsibilities. She felt guilty for not being able to help more. There was so much she didn't know, so much she hadn't learned yet, but she did what she could, working alongside him, always trying to improve. One afternoon, as the sky darkened earlier than usual and the wind picked up, David came in from the barn looking unwell. He had been out in the cold all day and it seemed to have caught up with him. His cheeks were flushed and his breath was ragged. Ingrid's heart sank as she looked at him. He had been working so hard, and now it seemed like the harsh winter was taking a toll on him. He sat down at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands, his body shivering despite the warmth of the cabin. Ingrid quickly moved to his side, placing a hand on his shoulder. "David, you need to rest," she said, her voice full of concern. "You're not well. Let me help." David shook his head weakly. "I'll be fine, Ingrid. I just need a moment." But Ingrid wasn't convinced. She could see the strain in his face, and the thought of him pushing himself further made her nervous. "You've been working nonstop. Please let me take over for a while." David's gaze softened, and for a moment Ingrid saw the man he had been before the weight of the ranch had taken over. He smiled weakly and nodded. "You're right. I suppose I've been pushing myself too hard." Ingrid immediately began taking over his tasks. She gathered what was needed for the animals, fed them, and made sure everything was in order for the night. David watched her from the table, clearly exhausted but grateful. Ingrid worked quickly, trying to keep the animals comfortable in the harsh cold, but her mind kept drifting back to David's condition. She couldn't help but feel responsible. He had worked so hard for years, and now, with the winter growing stronger, he needed help more than ever. That night, as the wind howled outside, Ingrid sat by the fire in the living room, her thoughts spinning. She had always thought of herself as strong, capable even. Back in Norway, she had managed to handle the demands of life on her own, but this was different. Montana was a different kind of place, and the land here wasn't forgiving. Ingrid knew that in the coming months they would face even harsher conditions, and as much as she wanted to help David, she couldn't help but feel like she wasn't ready for what lay ahead. The next few days were a blur. David's condition worsened, and Ingrid could see how much he was struggling. His body was tired and his fever left him weak. It was clear to her now that he couldn't manage everything on his own. The work on the ranch had been taking a toll on him for far longer than he had admitted. As much as he tried to downplay it, Ingrid knew he needed rest. But she also knew that with the winter storm coming, there was little time to waste. The local doctor was a few hours' drive away, and the roads were becoming impassable due to the snowstorm. The thought of David alone in his condition with no one to help made Ingrid's stomach twist with worry. She had to do something. She couldn't just sit by and wait for the storm to pass. She had to act. With determination in her heart, Ingrid knew what she had to do. The animals needed food, the barn needed to be secured, and she had to make sure David was taken care of. As the snow began to fall heavier, Ingrid braced herself for what was to come. She wasn't sure how she would manage it all, but she knew she couldn't let the ranch fall apart. Not now. Not when David needed her more than ever. The storm was coming faster than expected, and Ingrid realized just how serious the situation was. She had no choice but to take the reins, no matter how difficult it seemed. As the storm raged outside, Ingrid worked tirelessly to secure the ranch, to make sure that the animals would be safe during the worst of the storm. She wasn't sure what she was doing, but she trusted her instincts. David, though still weak, watched her from the cabin. His pride, though, was clearly hurt. He had always prided himself on being self-sufficient, but now Ingrid was the one stepping up. There was no time for him to be proud. The snow was falling harder, and the wind was whipping across the ranch with a fierceness that made it difficult to see. The storm was no longer a distant threat. It had arrived, and it was here to stay. Ingrid worked through the night, making sure every animal was accounted for, the barn was properly sealed, and that David had everything he needed to rest. She hadn't planned for any of this, but in the midst of the chaos, Ingrid realized something important. She wasn't alone anymore. For the first time since she arrived in Montana, she felt a sense of purpose. No longer was she the outsider who didn't belong. In that moment, she was the one holding everything together. And in the coming hours, she would prove just how strong she really was. The storm continued to howl outside, but inside the cabin, Ingrid knew that she had done everything she could. The blizzard had arrived, but she was ready to face it head-on. The blizzard had arrived with a fury no one had been fully prepared for. The wind howled through the trees and the snow came down in thick, heavy sheets, turning the entire world outside the ranch into a swirling, blinding whiteness. Ingrid stood by the window looking out at the storm as it raged across the land. It was hard to believe that just a few hours ago everything had seemed so calm. The storm had come quickly, and now there was nothing to do but wait and see what it would bring. Inside the cabin, the warmth from the fire did little to comfort Ingrid's growing sense of unease. David was still in bed, his fever not yet broken. He had barely been able to stand, let alone help with the chores or check on the animals. Ingrid had done all she could to make sure everything was secure. But now that the storm had picked up, she felt the weight of the situation more than ever. The ranch was remote, and with the snow piling up so quickly, it was unlikely anyone would be able to get to them for days. The animals, the barn, the ranch itself, everything depended on Ingrid now. The reality of it hit her like a cold gust of wind. There was no one else to rely on. If she made a mistake now, there would be consequences. The stakes were higher than ever, and the storm wasn't letting up. But Ingrid couldn't afford to panic. She had to keep her focus, stay calm, and think through every step. David had always been the one to take charge, but now it was her turn. She moved quickly, making sure the fire in the hearth was well stoked and the cabin was secure. Then she grabbed her coat and gloves, ready to brave the cold once more. The wind was loud outside, and the snow was coming down so thick that it was nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. But Ingrid knew she had to check on the animals again. She couldn't leave them out there in the storm, not with the weather growing worse by the minute. The cold was relentless, and she couldn't allow anything to happen to the livestock. They were the lifeblood of the ranch. As Ingrid stepped outside, the cold hit her like a wall. The wind cut through her clothing, biting into her skin, and the snow quickly began to pile up around her. She pulled her scarf tighter around her face, trying to shield herself from the biting chill. The barn was visible only as a shadow through the thick snowstorm. But Ingrid had learned the layout of the ranch well enough to find her way even in the worst conditions. The animals were huddled together in the barn, their breath rising in thick clouds of steam in the cold air. Ingrid worked quickly, moving from one pen to the next, making sure the hay was plentiful and the water was fresh. Her hands ached from the cold, and her breath came in ragged gasps as she moved through the barn. It was hard work, but it was the only work that mattered right now. Ingrid checked each stall twice, making sure nothing was left to chance. She was careful with every step, knowing that the animals relied on her. As she moved to the final stall, she heard a faint noise, a soft, distant sound that cut through the howling wind. At first, she wasn't sure if she was hearing things, but then she heard it again. A faint, almost desperate cry. Ingrid's heart skipped a beat as she turned toward the sound. It was coming from the far side of the barn. One of the horses, a young mare that had only recently arrived at the ranch, was making the noise. Ingrid rushed over, her heart pounding in her chest. As she got closer, she could see the mare lying on the ground, her body trembling from the cold. Ingrid's breath caught in her throat. The mare was stuck, unable to get up, and she was clearly in distress. Without a second thought, Ingrid moved to the horse's side. The storm outside was growing stronger by the minute, but there was no time to waste. Ingrid gently touched the mare's side, speaking to her softly to try to calm her. The horse's eyes were wide with fear, but Ingrid could see the trust in them. The young mare had always been a little nervous, but Ingrid had worked hard to gain her trust over the past few weeks. Now that trust was going to be the key to saving her. The ground beneath the mare was slippery from the ice and snow that had blown in through the cracks in the barn. Ingrid could see that the horse had fallen in a way that made it hard for her to get back up. She was exhausted and shivering uncontrollably, and Ingrid knew she had to act quickly. She knelt down beside the mare, trying to figure out the best way to help. The horse was heavy and the cold made everything more difficult. For a moment, Ingrid hesitated. She was alone and there was no one to help her, but then she thought of David lying in the cabin, too sick to be of any assistance. This was her responsibility now. She had to do whatever it took to save this horse. Ingrid gathered her strength and with a deep breath tried to lift the mare. The task was almost impossible, but Ingrid wasn't going to give up. She used all her energy, pushing against the weight of the horse, trying to lift her enough to help her get back on her feet. It took all of Ingrid's strength and determination, but after what felt like an eternity, she managed to get the mare into a position where she could stand. The horse wobbled for a moment, her legs unsteady, but Ingrid stayed by her side, steadying her. The mare took a few shaky steps, her hooves slipping slightly on the ice, but then she was up, standing tall again. Ingrid sighed in relief, her body trembling from the effort. She wasn't sure how long she stood there, just watching the horse, but eventually she knew she had done all she could for the moment. The mare was still a little shaky, but she was no longer in danger. Ingrid had saved her. With one last look at the horse, Ingrid turned and made her way back to the cabin. The storm was still raging outside, but Ingrid felt a sense of accomplishment she hadn't felt before. She had faced the blizzard head-on, and though the storm was far from over, she had made it through another challenge. When she returned to the cabin, David was still in bed, his fever higher than before. Ingrid quickly checked on him, making sure he was comfortable and warm. She helped him drink some water, and then, without saying a word, she settled down beside him. Her body ached and her mind was exhausted, but there was no time to rest yet. The storm was still growing stronger, and Ingrid knew there was more to come. But for the first time since she arrived in Montana, she felt a quiet sense of pride. She had proven to herself that she was capable. The ranch, the animals, and even David, all of them depended on her now. And no matter how hard the storm raged, Ingrid knew she was ready to face whatever came next. She was no longer the outsider she once felt like. She was a part of this place, and the strength she had found within herself would carry her through the storm. The storm raged for days. The winds never seemed to calm, and the snow continued to pile up, blanketing the world outside the ranch in an endless sheet of white. Ingrid had grown accustomed to the harsh conditions, but this storm was unlike anything she had ever experienced before. The days were spent tending to the animals, making sure the barns were secure and checking on David, whose condition had worsened since the blizzard had started. But despite the never-ending challenges, Ingrid never stopped. She couldn't. There was no one else to rely on. David's fever had come and gone, but his body was clearly worn down. He still tried to help where he could, but more and more, Ingrid was doing everything herself. She was getting used to the routine of checking the animals every few hours, making sure the fire in the cabin never went out, and keeping things as organized as possible. Each task, whether big or small, felt like an achievement. And though she was physically exhausted, she felt a growing sense of pride every time she completed one more thing on her list. One evening, as the storm finally began to slow, Ingrid stepped outside to take a breath of fresh air. The wind had lessened, but the world was still eerily quiet, as if the storm had sucked the life out of everything around them. Ingrid looked out over the ranch, her eyes scanning the white landscape. It was hard to believe that just days ago the place had been so full of life, with animals running across the fields and the sun shining brightly over the land. Now everything was covered in snow and there was an unsettling stillness in the air. But despite the bleakness of it all, Ingrid found herself standing taller. She had never known that she was capable of handling such a storm. She had feared for her life, for David's and for the animals, but she had gotten through it. She had done what she needed to do, and not once had she given up. In fact, the storm had brought out something in Ingrid she hadn't realized was there, a strength she hadn't known she possessed. David's recovery was slow, but each day he seemed to gain a little more strength. The fever had finally broken, and though he was still weak, he was beginning to be more alert. Ingrid had made sure to take care of him, giving him the rest he needed, but she could also see that he was starting to feel guilty for not being able to help more. He had always been the one to take care of everything on the ranch, and now he felt as though he had failed in some way. One morning, as Ingrid helped him sit up in bed, he looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and regret. "You've done more than I could ever have imagined, Ingrid," he said softly. "I don't know how I can ever repay you for what you've done." Ingrid smiled at him, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "You don't need to repay me, David. I'm here because I chose to be. We're in this together." David's eyes softened, and for the first time in weeks he looked at her with the appreciation she had longed for. He had always loved her, but now he saw her in a new light. She had stepped up in ways he never could have expected. He realized how much strength and courage she had, qualities that had been hidden beneath the surface but had come to life during the hardest of times. "Thank you, Ingrid," he whispered. "You've shown me that there's more to this life than just surviving. You've made me see that there's a future here for both of us. I'm proud of you." Ingrid's heart swelled at his words. She had never needed to be praised for her actions, but hearing David speak so openly about her courage meant the world to her. She had never felt truly accepted by the people in town, but here, in this moment, she felt that David saw her not just as his wife, but as an equal partner in everything they had built together. She wasn't just the foreign woman with an accent anymore. She was a strong, capable woman who had earned her place on the ranch and in his life. As the storm finally began to subside, Ingrid and David worked together to dig out the snow and check on the damage the blizzard had caused. The ranch had taken a hit. Fences were down in several places, and the barn had sustained some damage from the wind. But everything was still standing, and the animals had made it through the worst of it. Ingrid was exhausted, but the work felt different now. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about rebuilding, about moving forward together. The next few days were spent repairing fences and making sure the ranch was safe once again. Ingrid and David worked side by side, each feeling more connected to the other with every task they completed. The rhythm of life on the ranch had changed. The isolation and loneliness that Ingrid had felt for so long seemed to have lifted, replaced by a quiet sense of unity between her and David. The storms, both literal and figurative, had brought them closer. Soon, the roads were cleared enough for neighbors to start checking in on them, and word spread quickly about how Ingrid had handled the blizzard. The townspeople who had once mocked her for her accent and judged her for being an outsider now looked at her with respect. They saw her for what she truly was, a strong, intelligent woman who had saved the ranch and the animals during one of the harshest storms they'd seen in years. At first, Ingrid was hesitant to accept the praise. She had always felt like she didn't belong, but as the days went by, she began to realize that things had changed. The people who had once laughed at her were now offering their help, acknowledging her efforts and even apologizing for their past behavior. Ingrid had earned her place in this community, not because of her accent or where she had come from, but because of her strength, her determination, and her ability to rise to the occasion when it mattered most. David watched as the town's attitude toward Ingrid shifted, and though he was proud of her, he knew she had always been more than just the woman they had once seen her as. She had always been strong, always been capable. It was just that the storm had revealed those qualities to everyone else. The respect she had earned was not only for what she had done, but for who she had become. Months passed, and life slowly returned to normal. The snow began to melt, and the ranch started to recover from the damage done by the blizzard. Ingrid and David worked together, not just as husband and wife, but as partners who had weathered a storm that had tested their strength and commitment. They had faced challenges that neither of them could have imagined, and through it all they had come out stronger on the other side. Ingrid had come to Montana with hopes of a new life, unsure of what the future held. She had faced mockery, loneliness, and the isolation of being a foreigner in a new land. But she had also found something unexpected, a strength she never knew she had, a love deeper than she had imagined, and a place where she truly belonged. No longer an outsider, Ingrid had become a hero in her own right. The woman who had once been laughed at for her accent was now the woman everyone looked to for strength and guidance. And, most importantly, she had found the home she had been searching for all along, on the ranch with David, and in the community she had helped build with her own hands.